Hello everyone, welcome back to the course Research Methodology. We'll be continuing with the third module. My name is Divyansha Kumar and I'm your course faculty for this course. In this session, we'll be talking more about the different tools of data collection, how do you design your questionnaire, what is the scope of study, what do you understand by limitations of the study. Before we start with this session, let's have a quick recap of the last session where we talked about sampling, the different sampling techniques, what is the sampling design, what is the difference between non-probability and probability sampling, and why do we need sampling? Now, just keep in mind, we are teaching you this module when you are required to do an empirical research. If you're doing a doctrinal research, sampling and data collection in the primary form is not required. But if you're doing empirical, if your methodology being followed is empirical, then you need to do sampling and then you need to follow the tools of data collection for your primary data. Okay. So what was sampling? Sampling was basically a subset of your population which truly defined your population in all the characteristics that you wanted from a population. Since it was not entirely possible for the researcher to collect the data from the entire population, we chose sampling. How do we choose a sample? We choose a sample in two different methods. We can either choose it in a probability sampling technique or we can choose it by a non-probability sampling technique. Probability sampling techniques are usually applied when you are doing experimental research, and non-probability sampling techniques are applied when you're doing exploratory studies or when you're doing qualitative studies. All right. So that is what we did in the last session. Now we will move on to this session. Let's begin with tools of data collection. Before that, let's understand how many types of data are there. There are basically two types of data which you as a researcher can collect. One is the primary data and second is the secondary data. Primary data is data which is usually collected in your empirical research. Secondary data is a data which one usually collects in their doctoral research. Secondary data can also be used in empirical, but it is mostly used in the doctrinal research. All right, then how many ways can you collect the primary data? You can collect it with the tools of survey. In survey, there are mailed questionnaire which you email through maybe Google Form or different Survey Monkey, or there are different platforms in which you can float your surveys. Or there are telephonic surveys as well, where you call the respondents and you ask a few questions in the form of a survey. There are face-to-face surveys as well. This is one way in which you can collect your primary data. The second tool which can be applied is the observational studies, where the researcher maybe self-administers or asks someone to administer the expression of the respondents, the body language, the tone, the action, the spatial relation with the objects around the respondent. What is the temporal pattern? How does the respondent react to different situations? How does the respondent react to different objects that are there, to different paintings that are there, pictures, illustrations? What do the respondents do? So this is called the observation study. This is one of the tools in which you can collect your primary data. The third is the interview, where you interview the respondents with open-ended questions. The survey is that there are close-ended questions, but in interview there are mostly open-ended questions and maybe unstructured questions as well. So interview can be done telephonically, it can be done face-to-face, it can also be done through various electronic platforms like emails, Survey Monkeys, as I just mentioned, and there are many more that are there these days. The third tool in which you can collect your primary data is in the form of focus group discussions. In focus group discussions, there is basically a moderator and there are a group of people that are selected for your group discussion. It is usually self-administered or the moderator is kept, which may or may not be the researcher. So you can do it face to face, or maybe in these days, you can also use Skype or Zoom, because it's not always possible for the respondents to be available in one place. So these are the ways in which you can collect your primary data. Next, moving on to the ways or the tools in which you can collect your secondary data. Secondary data is usually in two forms, external or internal. So externally, you can collect it with the help of published data, already published reports, maybe which are available with the government agency or the private agency, or published in the form of encyclopedias or the review articles. There are white journals. A lot of way there are there where you can actually find this data that is published. Now, internally, there are unpublished reports that are not easily available to the general public. You can get those reports by getting in touch with those particular companies, or maybe get the survey data that is there in the company but is not published. So maybe Amazon has a backend data and they have not published it. So if you are able to find a project in which you need that data, you can come approach that company and get that data by certain marketing agencies maybe. So this is how you get the secondary data. Now, there are certain characteristics which you need to keep in mind when you're collecting the secondary data. One of the characteristics is it should be authentic. The sources from which you are getting the data should be authentic. It should always be cross-checked whether those sources are reliable or not. Second, the accuracy of the information. Please check uh, whether the information that is being provided is accurate or not. You should not include misleading information in your data. Third is the adequacy of the information. If you need a data for 5 years and the data being provided is not adequate or it is not sufficient, it's just of 3 years or 2 years, then please make sure that you get the data of the last 5 years. Fourth is the currency of data. Currency of data means that how latest is your data. Maybe you need a data which is just 5 years old and you've got data which is 20 years. So you don't need that data. It is not current. So make sure that the currency of data is also maintained. The last is the suitability of the purpose. The data that you have, make sure it is suiting your purpose and you don't include any data that is there. And just because you got the data, you have to include. That's not at all convenient. All right, so this is how you collect the secondary data and the pointers that you need to keep in mind. Now we will move on to the designing of the questionnaire. How do you collect your primary data? Majorly. So mostly we nowadays use questionnaires. That is the most common way of collecting the data. But it's a very technical way of designing. So you need to keep a few things in mind when you're designing your questionnaire. Questionnaires are usually again used in surveys because they mostly contain close-ended questions. Before we start with the designing, keep in mind there are 4 different ways in which you can design your questions. And those 4 different ways are actually the 4 different scales that are taught in statistics. So the data is actually collected in the form of numbers, right? But those numbers are initially framed in the form of questions. The questions can be framed according to the scales. The scales that I'm talking about are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Let's talk about what is a nominal scale. A nominal scale is a scale of measurement where each object is categorized in the form of discrete categories, and you can actually count them on your fingers or maybe count them in numeric values. Keep in mind you can only count them here and not measure them on a scale or with the help of a ruler. Example would be if you ask what is a gender, so it can be male, female, third gender. So you are actually counting the number of males there, the number of females there, or you are asking the marital status. So you're counting the number of single people who responded, the number of married people, the widowed, or maybe the divorcees. So you are actually counting them. This is called as a nominal scale. The second type of scale that is there is called the ordinal scale. As the name suggests, ordinal or in order. You can put it in order of 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can rank it. So this is the second level of measurement, and here ranking of data without establishing any degree of variation is done. and the data is actually in the form of maybe ratings or maybe certain scales that are already defined. So in this form of data, what do? You can actually either find the frequency distribution, you can find the proportion, you can use chi-square test here, and you can also find the median, the ranking, or use the U-test. All these statistical measures, I'm sure you can maybe read more about them in the reading material which we'll be providing. All right. Now, the third level of measurement that we have is called the interval scale. The interval scale is the third level of measurement, and it is defined as a quantitative measurement in which difference between two variables is meaningful. Which means if I say this is good and that is bad, so there is a difference that is there. Good is in a positive way, bad is in a negative way. So there's a clear difference. Most example in this type of scales are questions that are framed with the help of Likert scale. Likert scale is the scale that is used in statements that are having scales of strongly agree to strongly disagree. So if you're using these kind of scales, you're using an interval scale. And the measures in which you can actually form your analysis is with the help of standard deviation, variance, t-test, f-test. There are few characteristics that you need to keep in mind of interval scale. These are, it allows you the calculation of mean and median both. You can understand the difference between variables and you can subtract these values as well. You can also form certain numeric values in the form of scales, maybe the feelings, the behavior of a person. I'll be taking examples in the next few slides. These are just the characteristics that you need to keep in mind. Okay, now let's move on to the fourth type in this table given, that is the ratio scale. The ratio scale is the fourth level of measurement. Again, it is quantitative in nature, and the type of measurement allows you to capture the differences or the actual physical quantity in which you are measuring those characteristics. So if you're measuring maybe the height of a person, it gives you the quantity of the person, maybe 5 feet, 6 feet. You have the actual quantity which you can measure on a scale. You have, or maybe a weight of a person, maybe the area of that particular region, the distance, the age. So this is called as the ratio scale. Whenever you're designing a questionnaire, just keep this table that I have given, types of scale, in front of you. Keep in mind what do you need to measure, whether they have a nominal value, whether they have an ordinal value, and frame your questions according to that. I've given a few examples of each type of scale. Let's move on to the next slide where I've given the examples. The first scale was nominal scale. So here are some questions that are there. So if you need to know the gender, number of people who are lying in the male category, female category, third gender, or maybe there may be some responses that do not wish to disclose their gender. So you will have a count of each of them. Another example is, let's take up the third question. Any suggestions that are required in this course? Maybe the responses are yes, maybe no, or the responses are maybe. So you'll be able to calculate if there are 10 students, 2 of them said yes. So it means 20% of you have certain suggestions. So you'll be able to calculate the percentage. So these are examples of nominal scales. Next is ordinal scale. A few examples are, how was your academic performance this year? Some of them will click on poor, some satisfactory, good, best. So, poor, satisfactory, good, and best, they can be in the form of rating as well. Similarly, in the next question, what was the rating in your company? There are star ratings given, and you can choose any which rating that you got in your company. These are in the form of ordinal. You can easily calculate the percentile. You can calculate the median here. You can perform U-test here. You can perform chi-square for your analysis. Okay, let's move on to the third example of interval scale question. So let's see the second question. This is called as a rating scale. and I have actually given 0 to 10 rating here. How would you likely recommend this course to a friend? If it's not at all likely, so that is 0, and extremely likely, that is 10. You can actually measure this in the form of scale, and that is what it is, an interval scale. All right, let's move on to the last scale that is given, that is called the ratio scale. Now, in ratio scale, the examples of certain questions are what is your weight in kilogram, what is your age, what is your height, how many years have you done your full-time education, how many children live in your society. So, these are the form of ratio scales in which you can actually measure them on a scale. So, I hope that you've learned how to design different types of questions. And with the help of these questions, you can actually formulate your data. Once you get your data, you can analyze it with the different statistical measurements that were given in the table. This brings us the end of this module. And the assignment that you need to do for this module is the last assignment that you did in module 2, you take that research problem. You clearly mention what is the sample appropriate for your study. You define the entire population. You define your sampling frame. You tell us which sampling technique will be required and why is it required. You frame 10 questions at least based on your research study. And finally, you will write the scope and limitations of the study, which is actually the last part that I'll be taking up now. Now, the scope of the study is nothing but what you tell your audience, that what you've included in your study. Let's say all the areas on which you worked, the theories that you've applied, the parameters that you're trying to explore, what are you generally focusing on, what is the purpose of your research, what is the duration in which you did your research in, what were the geographical locations of the study, what was the population and sample of your study. So all this is covered in your scope of the study that you need to mention. Next, what are the limitations of the study? The limitations of the study are actually the barriers or the hindrances that came while you were doing in your research. So it may be related to the research design that you had chosen, maybe the sampling techniques that you had chosen that you could not find fit while you were doing that research, or the tools of data collection. Maybe they were adequate, maybe they were not adequate. The analysis that you had done, the findings that were there from your analysis, all this is discussed in your limitations of the study. So in your final part of the assignment, you will be giving a scope of the study of at least 500 words and limitations of the study of 300 words. And this is how we will end this module. Thank you so much. I hope you're being safe and I hope you learned something new in this module.